Okay, so today we're looking at target 7. Today we're going to be looking at the cosine graph. We're going to be changing the amplitude and period just like we did yesterday. But remember, yesterday we were working with the graph of the sine function. So the parent graph of the cosine function, if we do the cosine of 0, that's going to give us 1. If we do the cosine of pi over 2, that gives us 0. The cosine of pi will be -1. The cosine of 3 pi over 2 will be 0. And the cosine of 2 pi will be 1. So here's the parent function of the cosine function. So if we kind of look at some characteristics here, the amplitude would be 1. The period is 2 pi. The midline will be y equals 0. Okay, so that's our parent function. So now we're going to start playing with the amplitude. So the amplitude here will be 3. Okay. Everything else about this will be the same. So the cosine function starts up at its maximum. So in this case, it'll be at 3, then at 0, then its minimum, at 0, and back up at its maximum. Okay. So all I did here, the 3 just changed the amplitude. Essentially, it made this graph taller. Okay. So just like we did in the last lesson, remember the A value is the amplitude. The B value helps determine the period. So that formula for the period is going to be 2 pi divided by the B value. All right. So in this equation that we have, the A value will be 2. Remember, it's not -2. That negative is just reflecting the graph over the x-axis. The B value here is pi. The amplitude will be 2. It's the same as the A value. The period is going to be 2 pi divided by the B value of pi, which will give me 2. The midline is at y equals 0. Okay? So when I go to make my graph on the y-axis, since my amplitude is 2, I've got going up to +2 down to -2. Since my period is 2, that means this last tick mark will be a 2. Find out what I'm counting by, I take the period and I divide it by 4. Again, because I have 4 tick marks. That means I'm counting by halves. So I'll have 1/2. This will be 2 halves, which is 1. This will be 3 halves. This will be 4 halves, which is the 2. Okay. All right, so now I'm ready to graph. Usually the cosine starts up at its maximum, but because I have a negative in front, this has been reflected over the x-axis, so it's actually going to start down at its minimum. Okay. So there's a sketch of that new transformed function. So take a minute and try this one. All right, let's check in. Obviously, if you need a little bit more time, feel free to pause me. So the A value is 1/3. The B value here is 2. The amplitude will be 1/3. The period is 2 pi divided by the B value, so that means the period is pi. The midline is y equals 0. So as I go to label this graph, I'm just going to go up to +1/3, down to -1/3. The period is pi, so that will be my last tick mark. To find out what I'm counting by, I take the period and I divide it by 4. So that's telling me I'm counting by pi over 4. So that'll be pi over 4. This would be 2 pi over 4, which is the same thing as pi over 2. This would be 3 pi over 4. And next is 4 pi over 4, which is just pi. Okay, so now I'm set to graph this. So again, the cosine function starts up at its maximum. So we're starting at 1/3, then 0, down to its min, back to 0, back up to the max. Okay, so there's a sketch of that graph. Okay, so that's it. Basically the same thing as our last lesson. Now we're just working with the cosine function instead of the sine function.